Thank you, and welcome everybody. My role this evening is to introduce the report that's been produced to you. I think it will be difficult for me to replicate some of the passion that Yola has just shown us, but I do want to try and put some of the flesh on the bones of what is otherwise, as Yola has highlighted, quite a challenging report for us all. So in 2010, just 3 years ago, we officially missed the biodiversity targets, that target to stop biodiversity decline. Now that really was a wake-up call for us all, and I know with discussions with colleagues that many organisations had a little bit of a soul-searching session. What have we done wrong here? Have we, as organisations, failed? Have we failed our wildlife? Are we challenging enough anymore? What is it that we can actually do better? One of the answers to that is to work much more closely together as organisations, and this is a theme that's coming up again and again and again. So we're working much more closely in terms of a partnership, and the report that we're launching today, State of Nature, is the very first product of that partnership. And what a fantastic report it is. I don't know how many of you have actually read it on your way down here, but to pull so much complex and different information together into one report, into one coherent message, is one hell of a challenge. With 3,148 species that have been analysed, that really isn't an easy job. And it's a first stock take for us. A real benchmark with which we can then measure change that happens in the future. Now, I work for Plant Life, which is a very small conservation charity. For us, this represents a really significant achievement because we've got a small voice, and yet putting our own work into context, adding it into a report like this, means that we can speak much more loudly, much more clearly, and with our partners by our sides, which is really important. As Yola said, the headline figures, though, are truly shocking. 60% of species are in trouble. 30% of them are in serious trouble. Now that's out, we're banding percentages and we're banding figures around, but imagine in front of us here that there were 3 species that we're familiar with. A wood anemone, a butterfly and a bird. Sorry, I don't really know names of other taxa, I'm going to struggle with these things tonight. Put 3 taxa in front of us, one of them will be doing okay, one of them will be declining, and one of them will be on its way out of the door. So 3 taxa in a row in front of us, and that applies right across the board with all of the species that we deal with. And let's not forget, this is within one single generation. This is within 50 years. We're now seeing familiar species disappearing within a single lifetime. Now, I'm going to take a case in point here, a beautiful flowering plant called downy hemp nettle. This was recorded on a small farm just outside Veynoll. I pass it on my way into work every morning. And we know that this plant grew on this farm because the local headmaster, a lovely chap called Dick Roberts, asked his classroom to go out and pick some wildflowers and bring them into the class the next day. One of the girls returned with, as it was described, armfuls of downy hemp nettle. Now, fortunately, Dick Roberts was the county recorder. He was the botanist for Carnarvonshire at the time, and he recognised what this plant was, and he recognised its significance. It was a very, very rare plant. But the fields around this girl's farm were absolutely full of it. Practice has changed, though. This is an arable plant. It likes cultivated soil. And yet, with those changes in agriculture, with increasing use of herbicides and pesticides, and the change to pasture, the downy hemp nettle slowly died out. It was last seen in 1975. Extinct not just in Wales, but in the whole of the UK. That was the last recorded sighting of downy hemp nettle anywhere in Britain. Now, I was lucky enough to interview not the girl that collected that plant originally, but one of the girls that grew up on the farm. And she had very fond memories of what the farm was like then. It was a small, mixed farm. there were fields of potatoes, there were fields of oats, there was pasture. Everything was there in that one farm. And that was the key to the plant being there. It had its little niche within the farm, within the context of everything there. She said, sort of flippantly, yeah, of course, at that time, when that was around, there were corn crakes and red squirrels everywhere. And that just put it into context for me that within this woman's lifetime, these things have disappeared. The important lesson here for us is that diversity of management leads to a diversity of wildlife. Small mixed farms have become uniform now. All of that is swept aside. They are either big pasture areas or big arable areas. Agri-environment schemes unfortunately promote this. And we're getting dull uniformity everywhere. So our countryside is becoming a little bit like our high streets, losing all of that local character that's so important to them. They're becoming clean, tidy, predictable, and rather lifeless. Now, I'm just going to have a little talk about oak woodland, one of the habitats that's highlighted in the report. We've got 40% of our oak woodland in Wales, 26,000 hectares of it. It really is a magnificent habitat, as I'm sure we all know, full of iconic and well-loved birds, lichens, butterflies, bats and flowers. But even these are in serious decline. Welsh wood stitchwort has become extinct in 4 counties: Radnorshire, Merionethshire, Cardiganshire, Breconshire. Less than 5 plants of spreading bellflower are seen in the whole of Wales in some years. More alarmingly, though, I've been working with rare species all my life, but it's the common species that are disappearing now. Wood anemone, Blodyn y Gwynt, is an indicator of ancient woodland. Now, if you know it, it's got beautiful little flowers that track the sun. If you can be bothered to look at a patch in the morning and a patch in the evening, the flowers literally track the sun as it passes overhead during the day. At night, the flowers close to protect its pollen. And yet the real secret to wood anemone is that the seeds have a little oil gland on them. And that oil gland attracts ants. And the ants, thinking that they're getting a meal from the seed, transport the seed from one place to the next across the wooden floor. Wood anemone is dispersed through the landscape by ants. I think that's an amazing thing that I'm sure nobody here has actually seen happening. Now, you can imagine an ant carrying a seed around on its back. That ain't a very good way of getting around the countryside. And when you look at our fragmented woodlands now, with a small patch here and a small patch over there, no ant is going to take its time going from one piece of woodland to the next. So slowly over the centuries, wood anemone dies out and disappears from our landscape. It's these interconnected bits, this wildlife that's connected with each other, that's key to species decline. And for the first time, the State of Nature report reveals these losses across all species groups. I heard a Welsh government official once talking about woodland, and he said, when does a woodland stop becoming a woodland? Surely it doesn't matter if these things go. As long as we've got oak trees there, it's still a woodland. It's still, we don't need to worry about anything. Well, no, actually, that's not quite the case. Some recent research has shown that you need 83% of the species to be intact in a woodland for it to function as a proper ecosystem, providing those services like clear air, pure water, and flood regulation that we all now value. We must keep our eyes on the species, we must manage the habitat properly, and the ecosystem, the bigger picture, will look after itself. It's not all doom and gloom, of course. There are glimmers of hope. I feel like a bit of a doom merchant here, giving you these sort of lost stories from the report. The return of otters to our rivers is to be celebrated. The recovery of red kite from its Welsh stronghold. See, I do know some other organisms, not just plants. And the doubling of populations of three-lobed water crowfoot in our heathland. Now, these successes show that, given the chance, our wildlife can recover. It's tough, it's resilient, and it will bounce back. We just have to make sure that there are sufficient incentives and support to encourage good land management and good habitat management. I often get asked, what's the greatest threat to our wildlife? Is it climate change? Is it invasive species? Is it a lack of funding? Well, yeah, all of those things count, but the biggest threat is always, and always will be, that day-to-day gradual destruction of habitats. Ancient species-rich meadows are being dug up, hedgerows are getting removed, marshes drained, a bit of woodland cut down for a straighter bit of road that will, and this is a direct quote, save 18 seconds off your journey down south to Cardiff. It's a death by 1,000 cuts. As David Attenborough put it this morning on Radio 4, we've become rather good at chopping, cutting, felling, and poisoning our landscape. What's most galling is that these are the things that we can do something about. We can do something about the plough, the chainsaw, and the herbicide sprayer. They're the things that are having the most damaging effect now, because if they're not in place, it doesn't matter about climate change, it doesn't matter about invasive alien species. Those things, if they're not resilient enough and in good health to combat those other pressures, we're in deep trouble. Now, I'm a farmer's son. I grew up on a farm in Hampshire, a big arable farm in Hampshire. So I understand the difficulties of getting a balance between productivity and wildlife. But I've seen my own father strive as hard as he can to create the cleanest crops possible before the crop inspector came round, and if he found one wild oat, he was in deep trouble. But, on the other hand, I've also seen him take immense pride in a small patch of a very rare poppy called rough poppy that appeared in one of his field corners. After that, he left that corner unsprayed, and the rough poppy was allowed to thrive, and it spread across to other fields. Yes, we need productive farmland that sustains livelihood, but we also need a wildlife-rich countryside. My biggest regret through the 50 years covered by the report is that gulf between conservationists and farmers is just getting wider. The drive to increase productivity means that there's little space for nature on farms anymore. We need to get much better at coming together and talking. How many farmers are actually here in the audience tonight? Show of hands. One. Hooray for one farmer being here. That's brilliant. Farmers, for me, are the key to getting the countryside rich in wildlife again. If they're not part of the conversation, if we're not speaking their language, and if we can't provide sufficient support and incentives, they need to take conservation part of a productive farming system, then we've lost that battle. So the State of Nature report is our first response of the conservation community to this challenge. In the coming months, our organisations will be working much more closely together, speaking more clearly with a single voice and acting with a common, joined-up aim. This is already starting to place, and I hope Yola has actually left the room at this moment because I'm going to say that horrible M word. We had a meeting earlier between the authors of the report to actually start some of this and get it in motion. In the autumn, we'll be producing a challenge document which will outline the urgent action that actually needs to be taken. And that, yes, Yola, will be action out there in the field to make a difference. That action needs to be bold, it needs to be challenging, and it will be made to Welsh Government, it will be made to NRW, and it will be made to ourselves as well, so that we can be held accountable for our own actions. We're all accountable to play, and with this report, we've now got something that we can measure our success with. I want to end this slightly doom and gloom talk with a little ray of hope and a little celebration to the people that contributed to the report, the army of volunteers out there that made the State of Nature report possible. Now, I'm delighted to say that on Twitter today, #UnsungHeroes was trending at one point. I don't think it's ever done that before. And these really are the unsung heroes of the conservation world. Hours of time spent learning, searching, recording, and cataloguing our wildlife by often self-taught, passionate individuals that just love our wildlife. Now, I worked on a massive project to map every single plant in Britain and Ireland a few years ago, the New Atlas, and we worked out that if you paid every volunteer that took part in that for their time surveying, that would have cost £11 million to do. So we can't underestimate the contribution that the volunteers make. the role of the enthusiast, the interested, the curious, and the bystander that just appreciates what they see in front of them cannot be underestimated, but we must ensure that there are opportunities there to support them, to nurture them, to engage them, so that they can also play their part. State of Nature will be repeated in 3 years' time, and I hope then, when we meet together again in Cardiff, that we can have a little bit more of a positive message. Maybe not species recovery, but certainly that we're doing something about it. Thank you very much.